Καλησπέρα Πυθίτα, πίσω από τα μικρόφωνα ακούτε το Δημήτρη Ελευθεριάδη και τον Γιώργο Μελωνά, ενώ στην παραγωγή της πρώτης μας εκπομπής από το SNF Nostos 2026 βρίσκονται η Αρτεμισία Μαλιαρού και η Αναστασία Χατζικυριακίδου. Και στην πρώτη μας συνέντευξη καλεσμένος είναι ο Nic Dawes ή όπως είναι ευρέως γνωστός Nic. Είναι σύμβουλος δημοσιογραφικών και μη κερδοσκοπικών οργανισμών. Έχει ηγηθεί ειδησιογραφικών οργανισμών και οργανισμών για την προστασία των ανθρωπίνων δικαιωμάτων σε 3 υπήρους και στο παρελθόν ήταν εκτελεστικός διευθυντής του The City στη Νέα Υόρκη, αναπληρωτής εκτελεστικός διευθυντής του Human Rights Watch, διευθυντής περιεχομένου της Hindustan Times στο Δελχή και αρχισυντάκτης της Mail και Guardian της Νότιας Αφρικής. Είχαμε την τιμή να θέσουμε ερωτήματα και να συζητήσουμε με αυτόν τον πραγματικά χαρισματικό άνθρωπο ακριβώς έξω από το θόλο του Σταύρος Νιάρχος, όπου και συντόνισε πάνελ για τους δημοσίους χώρους και το ρόλο τους στη δημόσια σφαίρα. Παρακάτω ακολουθεί η συζήτηση στα αγγλικά. So, after the panel about the search races, the question is, so the panel focused on places like the Central Park, Lincoln Center, the Stavros Niarchos space as modern public squares. So our question is, what actually makes a public space actually public, and how do we measure it? Is it how beautiful it is? Is it how many people visit it every day? Is it how many like cultural events happen every week?
Public space means public, and I think that's very important to understand, that a public space is accessible to everybody, and that the communities that use that space and that live around that space feel some sense of ownership of it. And in some ways, at its best, public space actually constitutes a public, makes it possible for a public to imagine itself in community around that place. So I don't think you can measure it purely in hard data. You can't say 4 million people use the Stavros Niarchos Cultural Center or 40 million people use Central Park, and that's what makes it public. It's what relationship do those people individually and in community have with that place, and how rich and shared is that relationship. You also can't measure it purely on where does the money come from. Does the money come from the state? Does the money come from private donors? Is it a combination? What is the governance model? Those things are all very important, but they are not what determines the publicness of the place.
So the panel referred multiple times to the phrase bringing people in, which increases engagement. How can cultural institutions help reduce possible social fragmentations and serve people who are already engaged?
The panel gave us, I think, some very rich examples of the importance of bringing the community not just in physically, but into the process of designing the space and designing the ways in which it's used. So we had the examples from Central Park. Central Park spans some of the richest neighborhoods in the whole world, the Upper East Side, the Upper West Side, Columbus Circle. This is where billionaires, hedge fund titans live. But also the northern side of the park is East Harlem and Harlem, historical black neighborhoods, lower income neighborhoods, the real center of black culture in America for a long time. And Central Park was kind of split between the northern part and the southern park part. And what Betsy Smith outlined is the very deliberate process they engaged on to ask people living on the northern side of the park what they want, what they need. They wanted a pool that functions. Swimming in New York is very racialized. Black kids have much less chance to get swimming lessons, are at much higher risk of drowning, have far fewer access to aquatic facilities and pools, and it gets really hot in summer. So a pool is also a political thing, right? And a thing that really matters socially. So people wanted a pool. They wanted the facility to be open all year round. They wanted it to connect the top of the park and the bottom of the park. And so the design interventions that they made were deeply informed by those conversations. Similarly, at the Lincoln Center, when the Lincoln Center was first built, you know, we all think of it as this amazing cultural place with ballet and opera and theater and orchestra, but it was built in a way that was also quite violent. It destroyed a neighborhood, a lower income neighborhood planned by Robert Moses, the master builder of New York. And what they've done on the west side of the Lincoln Center now, with the support of the Stavros Niarchos Foundation, is to reopen the Lincoln Center to its community and to create a more shared space based on the input of that community, and to bring that into not just the physical space, but the programming that they do. So I think that those efforts to actually listen in a meaningful way, respond thoughtfully, and use the character of the design intervention and the programming to address inequity and open up access beyond just physical access, access to meaning and access to a shared reality. And I think we see that around us here as we sit in the SNFCC also, a space that is open to its neighborhoods, responsive to its neighborhoods, and an incredibly powerful story about what it means to build shared space and civic joy together.
So you've lived in three different, not only countries, but continents. And my question is, how realistic is it to actually have people participating in designing public spaces in maybe smaller cities or towns where people with high capital maybe don't exist, or they are too little? For example, we come from Thessaloniki, the second largest city. We had a big discussion about a park over there that would cover a part of the city because we don't have much green. But I suppose that in contrast with New York, we don't have the donors so that the philanthropists fund it.
Yeah, I mean, I think we can't pretend that all places are the same. All places are not the same. You know, New York is probably unique in the world for the concentration of wealth and the tradition of private philanthropy working together with the state. I think here in Greece, you see foundations like Stavros Niarchos Foundation trying to model what large-scale private philanthropy can do. But of course, as Eli Andriopoulos explained on the panel, you don't have the same deep philanthropic traditions here, and you don't, frankly, have the same resources. The country is just not as rich, and Thessaloniki, even relative to Athens, is not as rich. So those are real constraints, and we can't pretend that the same model is going to work everywhere. You do need the state. Eli also spoke about, you know, Southern Europe and the Southern Mediterranean being social states. You do need the state also to mobilize its imagination. And I think you need citizens and publics to ask for it, and to make the point, even politically, that space for leisure that is accessible to people of all income levels, space for shared conversation, space to be happy and relaxed, is part of social welfare. And of course, there should be local civic leaders, philanthropists, people with resources. They might not have the resources of a Stavros Niarchos Foundation, but they have some. If they can participate and be leaders, that's very valuable, and we should stitch together coalitions that support that. But citizens also need to demand it and say, it matters to me, you know, that I have a square that I can go and sit with my kids on a piece of grass, a place where I can be outside. Music, theater, ideas are for everybody. And those are political things that philanthropy at whatever scale can try to catalyze, but that states, governments, local governments, regional governments, European governments need to be responsive to. So making these incredible, powerful interventions like the SNFCC, I would think of them both as places for the people of Athens, but also as sparks of imagination about what can be possible. Doesn't mean you have to do it at this scale, but you can do it with this intentionality.
Okay, I keep the word demanded.
Yeah. From your experience, what should the relationship between private and public philanthropy look like?
I think it's very different in different contexts, different social contexts, different political contexts, and, you know, different economic, frankly, contexts. So I think, for example, in the US, we have a pretty deeply developed model of how you can do shared governance between the public sector and private philanthropy. At a place like Central Park, as Betsy Smith was explaining, you have the Central Park Conservancy that runs the park kind of on behalf of the people of New York. They have a very clear relationship, contractual and legal relationship with the city. The city provides a portion of the budget, and the Central Park Conservancy commits to finding the rest of the money. She said $70 or $80 million a year out of that $125 million budget. Here at the SNFCC, as Ellie was outlining, there is also a contract with the Greek government. There was a handover to the Greek state, but of course it still takes private philanthropy to sustain and maintain. So I think in different places it has to look different. Some things will have to be purely the state. Some things might have to be purely private philanthropy. Most will involve some kind of structured, accountable governance relationship where it can't be the pure will of the private sector and it can't be the pure constraint of the state. But that governance has to be clear, it has to be democratic, and it has to be very thoughtfully set out. And once you have those basic principles, I think you can apply them in quite different socioeconomic and cultural contexts. But it's not easy. You also need leadership that is able to navigate in these complicated multi-stakeholder environments, and people who are leadership who are able to still get things done while respecting the constraints and managing multiple voices.
Okay. And now from financial and organizational models of public space, we would like to go to these models, but for journalistic organizations, because you've led many organizations in different countries. And my question actually is, if you think there is an ideal model for journalistic organizations, and if we can make a mix with social economy. And since the four of us, we also have in the university a small social enterprise as a local journalistic media. And we would like also your advice. Can a social enterprise in journalism actually succeed, and how?
There is no perfect model for supporting journalism. Let's just be very clear about that. First thing to say is we are in an enormously complicated, difficult time for journalism. And we all operated in a world, and many of us began our careers, well, certainly I did, maybe not you, where we understood that there was one way that things worked, or maybe two. The one way that things worked was you have a privately owned for-profit entity, whether broadcast or print. You sell some advertising, maybe you sell a cable subscription, right? And you monetize that way. You monetize either your relationship with individuals through subscription, or your relationship with advertisers, or some combination of the two. And then you had the public sector with varying degrees of independence or not, in terms of your ability to provide broad information services and news, right? And those were kind of, I'm simplifying, but those were kind of the two models. And it's broken now. Advertising, we had pretty much a monopoly on advertising. We owned the advertising space as the news media and as the fact-based media. Now that is owned by Google and Meta, and they have gobbled up pretty much the whole pie, and we are left with nothing, essentially, less every single day. Subscriptions work for some of the most important and powerful titles. The New York Times, for example, has a famously successful subscription model. But the New York Times has more subscribers in Los Angeles than the Los Angeles Times does. So it doesn't work for everybody. It can work. And the public sector, I think, is still very, very important. Some places it is more free and more independent. Other places it's more constrained. But it's not enough to compensate for what we've lost in terms of sheer capacity, especially, and you know this acutely in Thessaloniki, especially in local media. And we don't only lose journalism when those models break down. We lose the ability to engage locally, to hold our leaders accountable, also to talk to each other and have a shared world of facts that we all come together around. So that is a profoundly important thing. That means we need other models. A social enterprise is one kind of model. Philanthropic support is another. Trying to build support from your readers to say what we do has value and has meaning, back our work, believe in us. And that's without even getting to what platforms you use. Like, do you write long text articles? Do you do video? Do you have community gatherings and bring people together? Are you basically producing data for AIs to read? So we are all in a very difficult, uncertain, scary, in some ways also thrilling moment of reinventing the model. Not a satisfying answer. I wish there was a satisfying answer. But what you are trying to do, what some of the organizations I work with is trying to do, some of the space that IMED is creating for us to talk about these things is an attempt to seize this historical moment and come out of it still with accountability journalism, with journalism that serves our communities, and really importantly, in terms of our discussion today, thinking about how we bring our communities into the process more. And that's something we can talk about a little more. And my personal belief is that the most powerful opportunity that we have to build a new economic model for our journalism is also to build a new model of community and inclusion and responsiveness in our journalism. And I think that's where the real key is going to be to the future. I can't tell you that we have answered all of the pieces of it, but I know that in that process of bringing in communities, responding to their needs, and really serving them as your mission, rather than serving an advertiser or even serving a subscriber in the traditional sense, is the opportunity that we have to rebuild.
And you also mentioned a shared reality, and I think George
yes. We are now living in a period of increased democratic fragmentation. How can public space become the start of an attempt to increase democratic engagement in the public sphere?
I think both public space and journalism that is publicly minded are pretty important levers for rebuilding connective tissue, civic and social and political connective tissue. There's, of course, a public space can be a place where a protest happens and a clash happens. We can go up to Syntagma and watch that happen every other day, right? No, you can say, well, that's just a sign of further fragmentation. Or you can say, well, actually, maybe in some ways, it's a place where forces in society are being given expression. So that's one version, one end of the spectrum. But the other is that we can gather, as we have here, around music, beauty, and see thousands of people come together around something that excites and thrills all of them, around imagination and culture. When you go to that library and you see people, we're sitting not far away from the Greek National Library, and you see people sitting and working at those desks, members of the public who've come in, drawing on the whole corpus of literature and ideas, and they may have different political views, they may have different personal identities, but they are drawing on a shared repository of wisdom and knowledge and ideas. There's something deeply collaborative in that, and it's not disappearing down a digital rabbit hole into an increasingly fractured or refined space. So I think coming together, actually seeing another human being instead of looking at your screen, hearing voices that you may agree with or disagree with, but hearing them together and having an opportunity to respond together, absolutely vital. And the same goes in our journalism. We have to create a journalism that is responsive to people's needs, so that people see us as helpful and people see us as serving them, rather than surrendering to the temptation, which is strong, to get the algorithm in your favor by being angry and by fragmenting more. It's very easy to have a model that is, we will show up high in your Instagram feed or on TikTok or in search because we are going for the angriest place. and driving polarization. So actually moving from a position of we will be successful to the extent that we help people and the extent to which people trust us. So there's a very strong relationship between the idea of shared physical and cultural space and a journalism that can actually contribute to more democratic outcomes and more pro-social outcomes.
I think that's the biggest takeaway from our discussion, that actually public space and journalism go hand to hand. And that's actually kind of positive thinking, that journalism, people say, oh, the newspaper is dying, everything now happens in the social media, in the websites, but actually thinking that maybe the future is for journalism in public spaces, in live, I think it's...
Live interaction is a very powerful thing for journalism, and I think it's possible to bring together really high quality traditional fact-finding, investigative reporting, and in-person engagement in live events. You can tell stories in a different way. Maybe you first research them a very traditional way. Maybe you publish them on your website in a very traditional way. Websites are traditional now, right? So maybe you publish it on your website in a very traditional way, but then you find a way to tell that story in a live environment. We saw that just the other day. We had a live journalism event here at the Nostos Festival, telling some incredible stories with imagery and with the grain of the human voice. The organization that I used to lead in New York, we held public forums where we would just ask people, what's troubling you? What's an issue in your neighborhood? Completely off the record, listen to them. Then we would go back and try to find answers to the questions that they have, write stories that are responsive to those questions, help them with anything from how and where should I vote to my apartment in public housing is freezing cold and I'm trying to get the heat turned up. What should I do to get that problem fixed for me? And that's also an investigation, because you have to go and understand the law. Who is the official responsible? Which buildings have the worst problems? And then report back and close the loop. So yes, combining physical togetherness and conversation, whether it's kind of on the record and more performance-oriented or more dialogue, stitches together these things that we're trying to do when we report in a traditional way.
I think you just provided us with an amazing idea of what we're going to do when we go back to Thessaloniki.
Back to different models of creating a public space from the community. You worked in different countries, and you obviously had different job roles. But I would like to ask where the community was stronger and it was heard better. If you have
That's a very interesting question. So I have worked in South Africa, in India, and in the US, and then I've done some global work. I would say, at the time when I worked in South Africa, we did the newspaper that I led in South Africa had a very strong identity, as it was, one version is it's a very political newspaper, very investigative, very hard on the government. I would fight a lot with the president. And that's one way of thinking about that paper. But also it was a paper that people kind of believed in that was on their side. And we had things like a book festival. We had a whole program celebrating young leaders. We had regular breakfast events. And our readers felt like they earned the paper. And people would stop me in the airport or on the street and tell me what they thought about. But we didn't completely, I don't think, activate the power of that community. We hadn't really realized yet. I was the editor in the mid 2000s up to 2013, and we did events and they were great, but I don't think we had fully realized the power of that. And in New York City, where I ran a startup, we very early began to take it to the communities, and no one knew us. So very different situation. No one stopped me on the street and said, hey, what did you do this week? But we try to build our interaction with the communities in relation to already existing community organizations. Kind of an uncomfortable thing for journalists to say, I'm going to go to a community organizer and say, can you bring some of your people? Can you let them know? But ultimately very, very effective. So I wouldn't say the community was stronger in one place or another place. In India, I worked for a very big commercial news organization where I think people were very afraid of hearing from the public, frankly. And if we had designed a more careful way to do that, I think it would have been very powerful. There are tons of civic activists and community organizers and interesting people there. So I don't think the community is stronger any place, but the willingness of different kinds of journalism organizations to engage with that varies. And I think in a place like Thessaloniki, like in a second city, where people are frustrated about being the second city, probably, where there's very deep regional identity, where you live in a more complicated part of the country, like even geopolitically and economically, I think, maybe you can invent some things there that are pretty special to where you are. And I'll just add, I've just come from Tbilisi, Georgia, from a journalism and ideas festival called the Zeg Storytelling Festival. Maybe this will sound familiar to Thessaloniki. Georgia is a place that has Russia over here. It has Iran over there. It has Armenia and Azerbaijan over there. And it has Europe on the other side. It wants to be part of Europe. Its government is becoming closer to Russia. It has this history of being fought over. None of this is like Thessaloniki in any way, of course. There's no comparison. Of course, there's some comparison. How far away is Turkey? How far away is North Macedonia? But also a place where there are maybe less resources than there are here. And a very clear local identity and real needs. And so not so much in relation to the geopolitics necessarily, but in relation to the place that Thessaloniki is, I think you could try some really cool things. And one of the great things about a university as a platform is that it has this different identity. You're not like at a commercial newspaper where the owner has views or is afraid of what Mitsotakis is going to say, or or is afraid of other local political interests. So maybe, I don't want to provoke you too much, but maybe there's an experiment that you can run. Maybe it's a cool project to do.
I think it is. And actually, the radio of Aristotle University now has 2-3 months that has begun. So let's see where it goes. Thanks a lot. This was our first interview from Nostos Festival.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all.